That the Switch has an impressive growing library of shooters is pretty neat. But if you could take your home console shmups with you on the go, what would you take? Cave titles are likely going to be everyone's go-to, us included. Mushi Futari on the go? Yes, please. But barring such pie-in-the-sky dreams as that, having some kind of quality shmup with you anywhere you might be should make the Nintendo Switch pretty appealing, even now. The Switch's Namco Museum, and by extension Galaga 88, is still a little ways out, but in the meantime, players have a neat-looking indie shmup called Graceful Explosion Machine, created and published by Canadian indie outfit Vertex Pop. As the first all-original side-scrolling shmup to hit the Switch's eShop, what kind of experience does it offer? Let's take a closer look. Graceful Explosion Machine tasks players with blasting their way through 4 planets worth of deep space subterranean stages with the firepower of the titular ship known as the Gem. Movement is as you would expect, with the left analog or directional buttons moving the gem around the screen at a decent enough rate. It's a bit on the twiddly and fiddly side though, especially with the amount of enemies on screen in later levels. Though not immediately, players will eventually have access to 4 different weapons to take on their opposition. The standard blaster is first, which does a good job of taking out small enemies. It can overheat with extended use though, and requires a cooldown period if it's used too much. This blaster is the only weapon that doesn't use special energy, which is indicated in a gauge at the bottom of the screen. A short-ranged blade attack does a good job of defending against crowds of smaller enemies as well as some medium-sized foes. This weapon requires a relatively small amount of energy to use. A long-ranged laser works wonders against armored enemies, but uses quite a bit of energy. Finally, a salvo of homing missiles is best used against fast enemies in small crowds. The energy required is kind of high, but they work very well. Each of these weapons is mapped to a single button on the Switch's controller for easy access and use. The gem can also switch direction instantly by pressing the L or ZL button, which definitely helps in taking out the many enemies that can easily corner the player in no time at all. In a pinch, players can also dash out of the way by pressing the R or ZR buttons. The dash also has a small gauge. 2 dashes can be used in succession, and the gauge recovers fairly quickly. A huge variety of foes await through Graceful Explosion Machine's 36 main stages. As enemies are destroyed, gold crystals will briefly remain, which can be picked up to fill the gem's power reserves for its special weapons. A decent amount of skill in switching between blasters and special weapons is definitely required to make good progress, especially with cooldowns for both the main blasters and special weapons. Even without crystals though, if a player's special weapons are fully depleted, they'll recover over time. Each stage is a side-scrolling defender-style arena that loops indefinitely as players move through them. A radar HUD is present at the top of the screen which shows enemies' positions. Most of these stages require players to overcome 3 progressively more difficult phases before they are cleared and new stages open up. The whole planet doesn't necessarily need to be cleared to unlock others. Only a certain amount of stages need to be cleared before more planets actually open up. The final stage of 9 for each planet is an endurance run with a single life. The goal is to activate and collect a warp crystal. When this warp crystal is collected, special challenge stages for the planet in question are unlocked. The gem has 3 life slots which, when depleted, will result in the gem exploding. Colliding with enemies, their shots, or hazards like laser barriers result in damage. Beyond the first phase, players can continue at the beginning of the phase they died at the cost of a life. Life recovery items can also be obtained from defeated enemies as well to keep the good times rolling. Graceful Explosion Machine is fairly fun on the whole, but it definitely has its issues. Dashing, for example, will often fling an unsuspecting player into a cloud of materializing enemies or a laser barrier, resulting in damage. Some enemies are a little on the cheap side too. Even the easiest basic enemies can sneak around and murder the player. There's also not a lot of leeway when it comes to blaster and special attack management. There will often be times when the gem is simply crippled with completely overheated and depleted weapon systems that take a bit too much time to recover, even when the player is collecting a huge swath of crystals. We also felt as if we spent most of our time flying in reverse while attacking our enemies. It feels as if the game is less offensive based and more defensive at all times, which is a little weird, even if it does work. The enemy opposition, when compared to the weapon loadout overall, is pretty imbalanced as well. It ends up being pretty frustrating, and if we're honest, we were never really able to truly manage the gem's weapon systems with the game's later enemy swarms. In addition, the objectives for an A rank and above are insanely high. Given the inherent balance issues with Graceful Explosion Machine, this can lead to more frustration overall, despite its fun factor. Each stage in Graceful Explosion Machine has a letter grade applied when the stage is complete. All of these letter grades are earned through scoring, which is achieved in a few different ways. As enemies are dealt with, a multiplier will build in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Killing enemies in rapid succession will keep this multiplier growing, and a kill indicator showing enemy kills at certain milestones like 20, 50, 100, 200, and so forth shows at a glance that the chain is still going. If players take too long getting to and dealing with the next foe, it will drop down to 1 again. A countdown indicator behind the multiplier shows how much time is left before it is nullified. If a player is hit, the multiplier is also removed. Knowing how to chain the entire stage is critical in getting the best scores, but while the multipliers can be carried from one phase to the next, actually hitting an enemy before it dissipates is extremely difficult. At stage end, players receive bonus style points with regards to time and hits taken, with additional style points for highest multiplier and kill combos. Style points can also be applied mid-stage with fancy use of special weapons. These are added to the total score and the stage's letter grade is then applied. There are online leaderboards for every stage and challenge in Graceful Explosion Machine, so high score chasers will definitely want to refine their skills in the game to score as high in every facet of the game as possible. That said, there's a fair amount of replay in the score chasing alone if players are able to overcome Graceful Explosion Machine's shortcomings, of course. As far as Graceful Explosion Machine's presentation is concerned, it has some pretty decent chops. It definitely makes a name for itself with solid audiovisual cues that make it stand out, despite essentially being a Defender-style game at its core. Bright and colorful, Graceful Explosion Machine has a striking geometric look to it with all kinds of 45-degree angles, square explosions, and bright, easy-to-see enemies. The player's cartoonish ship actually looks fairly out of place because of this, but it still works fairly well. However, over time, the visuals start to feel very samey. Sound-wise, Graceful Explosion Machine's effects work well and its music is pretty chill with a cool, somewhat laid-back synthesized OST that sets a decent tone for the underground battles that will ensue throughout the game. Graceful Explosion Machine's sound effects and audio cues also work very well, with nothing really getting lost in the shuffle. Rounding out its presentation are simple sound options as well as a super simple UI that is pretty much impossible to get lost in. All in all, there's definitely a lot to like about Graceful Explosion Machine, but how does it stack up? Let's take a look. On the whole, despite being a little twiddly, Graceful Explosion Machine controls decently enough, until players need to dash. Then all bets are off. Graceful Explosion Machine is plenty challenging, but having a power system that frequently cripples a player's means of fighting back, especially later on, is kind of the wrong kind of difficulty. In terms of length, with over 36 stages, numerous challenges, and online leaderboards for all of it, there's a ton of game to play here. The in-game visuals to Graceful Explosion Machine are striking and immediately recognizable, with all kinds of neat enemies. It gets visually boring over time though. In terms of sound, Graceful Explosion Machine's music and effects work well, and even though it's great, the OST might be a bit too laid back. When it comes to ingenuity, Graceful Explosion Machine is really just Defender without the defense. Or is it too much defense? Who can really tell? Its extra weapons and more intense enemy opposition make it worth a look definitely, but its core structure is something we've all seen before. At $13 US, Graceful Explosion Machine might seem a little pricey, but it has enough gameplay to make its cost well worth the price of admission. Graceful Explosion Machine is a step in the right direction for the Nintendo Switch, despite being fairly imbalanced in the end. Hopefully, more shooting games will become available as time goes on. Until then though, Graceful Explosion Machine is well worth a look, and it gets a decent 3.75 out of 5. You can get Graceful Explosion Machine exclusively on the Nintendo eShop for about $13 US. There are actually a decent amount of shooting games on the Nintendo Switch already, though a lot of them are ports. Here are other shmups that can be played on the go.